Hey everybody, welcome to the first update for The Boy with Nails for Eyes, the graphic novel now crowdfunding on Unbound. For this update, I thought I would go through one of the images from the prologue of the comic and just talk about the work that went into producing it. So the first stage was preparing a rough sketch of what I intended to have as the final image. This was really nothing more than 10-15 minutes of rough sketching. I deliberately kept it really loose so that I could get something that felt balanced and right, rather than something that was too pernickety and too constrictive. I wanted something that I could play with rather than something that I had to colour in the lines, if you know what I mean. As it turned out, this image really was quite a long way from how the actual final image ended up looking. The foreground elements, the town, you can see the rooftop extending away, and the crows, which are perched along the rooftop and flying in the air, these elements changed considerably from the first sketch image through to the final image, probably because I was just afraid of the amount of work that I knew would be required to actually produce an image that was required at this stage. So the Behemoths were created using a lot of different photographs of buildings. The first Behemoth that I built was primarily composed from two buildings. That was Will's Memorial Building in Bristol, and there were also parts of Bristol Cathedral, but also Westminster Abbey, and various different buildings. In fact, so many buildings that I would really struggle to identify them all. Essentially, lots of photographs were taken. These were then cut up in Photoshop and reassembled so as to actually create the illusion of a three-dimensional structure. If you were to print the Behemoth itself, full scale, my guess is that it would stand about 3 or 4 meters high. That's a ridiculously high level of detail to work in, but I knew that I would have to rely upon the images that I was creating now further down the line to create further images of the Behemoths. I knew that I might need to do them in extreme close-up, so creating something that was really, really highly detailed would mean that I had that to draw upon safely in the future. The town that Bobby lives in, the town that the story takes place in, is as important as any of the characters in the story, as important as Bobby and as important as the characters that are going to be introduced in subsequent volumes of the story. When I first started creating the comic, and in fact started illustrating it, I hadn't actually come up with any coherent design for the town. When I was creating this image, I realized that the initial sketch that I had, that just wasn't going to fly. This was the prologue of the story. It needed to establish the setting, it needed to give people something to grab onto, they needed to get an idea of the layout of the space where the story was going to take place. So the first thing that I did was create a map of the town. I actually did this by taking an old Victorian map, cutting it up in Photoshop and then reassembling it into the shape that you see here. Actually, in later stages, I actually built a 3D model of the town. This allowed me to go for a walk around its streets, to explore, to see the town itself from street level and cook up different ways of looking at it, different shots that I could then use in the comic, which I might not have been able to come up with if I was just trying to visualize the thing in my head. If I had had it at the time, it would have been incredibly useful. As it was, I had to draw this image just using the map that I had created and carefully working up the perspective on the paper. Now, the paper that I used was Bristol board. That's wonderfully smooth stuff. It's typically used for comics. I drew on the design first using a pencil, diluted ink washes applied to the image, and then used to render shadows and basic tonalities. That's then worked into using pencil, chalk, charcoal, acrylic, raw ink in very, very small amounts, and pretty much anything that sticks to paper. So I wanted to bring in some of the digital elements into the image before I actually brought in the behemoths. The most important of these was the sky. So over the years, as with the buildings, I gathered a large library of cloudscapes, just photographs that I took from any high vantage point I could find whenever a day was, cloudy in a really interesting way, where you get layers of high cloud and then you get low levels of cloud, and the lighting is really, really interesting. That way I built up a huge bank that I could draw upon to actually create images in this way. Aside from that, I brought in a simple photograph again that I took just to create a texture for the sea. I knew that at the later stage in the image that was probably going to be mostly blanked out by fog and cloud and so forth, but it was important to actually have that underlying detail. I really do feel that having detail which doesn't necessarily show, but it kind of feeds through other elements, really gives a feeling of depth and weight to an image which is otherwise lacking if you go for a kind of shortcut. The fog. This was essential to blend in the clouds and the sea, the two photographic elements that I brought in previously. There would have been a relatively simple way of doing this, of just using Photoshop to digitally paint in some fog. Well, I tried this, and I felt that the results, they felt like they'd been laid onto the image rather than woven into it. What I decided to do was take another scan of some paper, which I had heavily ink washed using a very, very dilute ink. I used that as fog instead of just a straight digital paint. That meant that the fog really, again, had depth and texture. It made it feel like it was really there, and it acted as a kind of bridge between these photographic elements and really gave a feeling of, further depth and distance within the picture. So the next element, the crows. The crows were, again, the major plot point within the prologue. They had to be quite prominent. They had to be placed within the context of the town as well. These were relatively simple to do. I sketched out some crows onto, I think it was Bristol board again, scanned those drawings into Photoshop. At this stage there was a bit of cheating. I took the image, copied it, pasted a couple of times, and that way I actually managed to make the single drawing do a lot more work than otherwise it would have done. The one major detail left to do was smoke from the factories that ring around the town. This was a simple matter of digital painting. In other places throughout the comic I've had the smoke quite thick and claggy and sooty and black and grimy, but here I basically cheated. I knew that this had to be an image where the smoke was quite transparent in order to be able to actually see the elements behind it. If I'd created the smoke to be opaque, then the image, it probably would have had a lot of visual impact, but the actual essential elements wouldn't have been communicated. That's the finished image. I would estimate that the whole thing took maybe 3 months to complete, maybe more. But it was really with the completion of this image that I felt that I had established a kind of feel for the story and a setting for the story. I had a key component, the actual town itself, in a state where I could start to move the pieces of the narrative around in it. I could come at the story a bit more concretely. I think it is one of my favourite images from the entire graphic novel so far. And yeah, I hope to create several more images of this scope and this scale. So that's it for this update. Thanks very much for listening, and if you want to support the project, just visit www.unbound.com/books/nails-4-eyes. Otherwise, you can visit my website, basementgarden.uk, and you can follow the links there to the project and pledge to get your name into the first edition of the book, but also for postcards, limited edition prints, and all sorts of other goodies like that. So, thanks very much for your time, everyone, and hope you have a good one.